The morning sun cut through the glass walls of Titan Defense Solutions like a blade, sharp and unforgiving, illuminating the sterile conference room where careers were made and broken with the casual cruelty of men who believed their power was absolute. And on this gray Monday morning, as autumn leaves swirled outside the windows and the scent of expensive coffee filled the air, Damon Archer sat among his colleagues, his hands folded carefully on the table before him, his face a mask of professional composure that had taken him 8 years to perfect. 8 years of excellence. 8 years of staying late when others went home, of solving problems that should have been impossible, of preventing security breaches that would have brought this company to its knees. 8 years of waiting for the promise that had been whispered to him again and again, like a prayer that was never answered. Your time is coming, Damon. Just around the corner. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But as Stephen Harrington stood at the head of that table, his smile confident and his posture relaxed in the way of men who had never once questioned whether they deserved their place in the world, Damon felt something cold settling his chest, because he had seen this before, twice before, and the words that came from Harrington's mouth were familiar in their careful construction, in their coded cruelty, in the way they could destroy a man's dreams while sounding perfectly reasonable to anyone who didn't know how to listen for what wasn't being said. "I'm pleased to announce," Harrington began, his voice carrying that particular blend of authority and false warmth that middle management had perfected, that after careful consideration of all the qualified candidates, we've selected Kyle Brennan for the senior cybersecurity analyst position. And there it was, the knife, sliding between ribs with surgical precision. Damon's eyes found Kyle across the table, watched the younger man's face flush with something that looked uncomfortably like shame, watched him fail to meet Damon's gaze. "Kyle brings exactly the kind of leadership presence we need in this role," Harrington continued, each word chosen with the precision of someone who had been trained never to say what he actually meant. His cultural fit with the team, his big-picture thinking, his ability to navigate complex interpersonal dynamics, these are the qualities that will take our division to the next level. Leadership presence, cultural fit, big-picture thinking. The phrases hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had just been fired, and everyone in that room knew what they really meant, even if no one would ever say it out loud. Because that was how it worked in places like this, in gleaming corporate towers where diversity was celebrated in glossy brochures but quietly suffocated behind closed doors. You couldn't point to any single word that was wrong. You couldn't prove that leadership presence meant anything other than what the dictionary said. But Damon knew. God, how he knew. Because he had heard these same phrases used to explain why he wasn't quite right for the last promotion and the one before that. And now this one. The third time in 4 years that he had been passed over for a position he had earned with blood and sweat and brilliance that no one in this room could honestly deny. He felt his reflection staring back at him from the glass walls. A black man in a perfectly pressed shirt and tie, his MIT degree framed on the wall of his cubicle 3 floors down, his performance reviews all marked exceptional, his technical skills unmatched by anyone in this division. And yet here he sat, watching a man with half his experience and a quarter of his talent receive the recognition that should have been his. Damon's hands tightened imperceptibly on the table, his jaw clenched just slightly, and for a brief moment, his carefully maintained professional mask cracked. Just a hairline fracture, barely visible, but enough that Lisa Tran, sitting 2 seats away, caught his eye with a look of shared fury and frustration that told him he wasn't imagining this, that she saw it too, that the injustice was real and visible to anyone brave enough to look. The meeting continued, Harrington's voice droning on about strategic initiatives and quarterly goals. But Damon heard none of it, because something inside him had broken, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet finality of a support beam giving way after years of bearing too much weight. This wasn't anger, not yet. This was something deeper and more terrible. It was the moment when hope dies, when a man who has played by every rule and exceeded every expectation finally understands that the game was rigged from the start, that no amount of excellence will ever be enough, that his invisibility is not an accident, but a feature of a system designed to keep him exactly where he is.
When the meeting finally ended, Damon stood with the mechanical precision of someone moving on autopilot, gathering his notepad and pen with hands that felt disconnected from his body. Kyle approached him near the door, his face flushed and uncomfortable, his words stumbling out in an awkward rush. "Hey man, congrats on... I'm sure next time, you know." But Damon couldn't hear the rest, because the words "next time" echoed in his skull like a cruel joke, like the punchline to a story that had stopped being funny years ago. He nodded, managed something that might have looked like a smile, and walked away before Kyle could see the devastation in his eyes. Back at his cubicle, Damon sat down and pulled open his desk drawer where he kept his performance reviews, all 8 years of them, each one filled with words like exceptional, invaluable, demonstrates extraordinary technical expertise, prevented critical security breaches, goes above and beyond expectations. He laid them out on his desk like evidence at a trial, like proof of his worth, like artifacts from a life where merit actually mattered. And as he stared at them, at the glowing assessments written by supervisors who had praised his work while systematically denying him advancement, he felt something twist in his chest that was equal parts rage and despair. Across the office, Lisa Tran was already at her computer, her fingers moving with practiced speed as she documented every detail of that meeting in her hidden files: the date, the time, Harrington's exact words, the demographic breakdown of everyone who had been considered and everyone who had been selected for promotion over the past 18 months. She had been keeping these records in secret, watching the pattern emerge with the clarity of someone who understood that injustice without documentation is just another story that no one will believe. And when she caught Damon's eye through the maze of cubicles, she gave him a look that said, "I see it, I'm watching, and when the time comes, we'll have proof." But Damon didn't know about Lisa's files yet. All he knew was that for the first time in his 8-year career at Titan Defense Solutions, he couldn't bear to sit in this building for one more second. He stood, grabbed his jacket, and walked toward the elevator with the deliberate calm of someone who was one moment away from breaking entirely. And as he stepped out into the autumn air, as the door closed behind him and he left work early for the first time in his professional life, he carried with him the weight of a betrayal that was too heavy for any man to bear alone. A weight that he would soon bring home to the only person in the world who could help him carry it. Because what Stephen Harrington didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Damon Archer's wife was not just any woman. She was a weapon. And she was about to be aimed directly at the heart of everything they had built. The townhouse in Arlington was painted in the warm amber light of early evening when Damon's car pulled into the driveway, the engine cutting off with a quiet finality that matched the emptiness he felt inside. This was supposed to be his refuge, this modest home with its neat lawn and cheerful red door, the place where he could shed the armor of professionalism and simply be a husband, a father, a man at peace. But as he sat in the driver's seat, staring at that red door through the windshield, he found he couldn't summon the energy to move. His hands rested on the steering wheel like dead weight, his shoulders slumped in a way they had never been before. And for a moment, he considered simply staying here in the car, suspended between the world that had broken him and the family he was afraid to face. But then the door opened, and Isaiah appeared on the front steps, his 10-year-old face bright with the kind of innocent joy that children carry before the world teaches them about disappointment and injustice. "Dad!" he called out, waving with the enthusiasm of someone who still believed his father was invincible. And Damon forced himself to move, to open the car door, to walk up those steps with legs that felt like they were carrying twice his weight. "Hey, buddy," he managed, his voice rough around the edges, and he pulled his son into a hug that lasted just a moment too long, holding on to that innocent happiness like a drowning man clutching driftwood. Inside, the smell of dinner filled the house. Patricia's cooking, something with garlic and herbs that normally would have made his mouth water, but now just reminded him that he would have to sit at that table and pretend everything was fine. Patricia was in her home office just off the living room, still in her army uniform, the stars on her shoulders catching the light as she looked up from her paperwork. She was beautiful, his wife, with eyes that missed nothing and a presence that commanded respect in any room she entered. And when those eyes found his face, when they traced the lines of exhaustion and defeat that he knew he was wearing, despite his best efforts to hide them, he saw her expression shift from greeting to concern in the space of a heartbeat. "You're home early," she said, her voice carrying that particular note of careful observation that came from years of military training, years of reading situations and assessing threats. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact, but Damon heard the question underneath it. What happened? He managed a shrug, a gesture that was supposed to convey casualness, but instead revealed just how fragile he was in that moment. "Quiet day," he lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Thought I'd beat the traffic." But Isaiah, perceptive in the way that children sometimes are when adults think they're not paying attention, had already noticed something was wrong. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, his homework abandoned on the table, his young face creased with worry. "Dad, are you okay?" he asked, with that directness that only children possess, that ability to cut through pretense and ask the questions adults are too polite or too afraid to voice. And Damon felt something crack a little deeper inside him, because he had worked so hard to shield his son from this, to keep the poison of the workplace from seeping into their home, to be the strong father who had all the answers. "I'm fine, buddy," he said, but his voice wavered just slightly, betraying him. "Just tired. Long week." Isaiah didn't look convinced, but he nodded and returned to his homework, though Damon could feel the weight of his son's gaze following him as he moved through the house like a ghost of himself. Dinner was a careful dance of normalcy and silence. The four of them, Damon, Patricia, Isaiah, and the invisible weight of everything unspoken, gathered around the table as Patricia served the meal and Isaiah chattered about his science project on solar systems. But every few minutes, the boy's words would trail off and he would look at his father with those worried eyes, and Damon would realize he had been staring at his plate, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth, his mind 1,000 miles away in a glass conference room where his worth had been measured and found wanting for the third time. Patricia said little, but she was watching, always watching. She saw the way his shoulders curved inward, the way he barely touched his food, the way his eyes had lost the spark that normally lit them when he talked about his work or played with Isaiah or simply sat beside her in the couch in the evenings. She had been watching him dim for months, if she was honest with herself, watching the slow erosion of the man she had married, the brilliant engineer who had once talked about his projects with such passion, who had believed that hard work and excellence would be rewarded. But tonight was different. Tonight he looked like someone who had finally given up. And then Isaiah, precious, perceptive Isaiah, asked the question that would change everything. He set down his fork and looked at his father with those wide, honest eyes, and his voice was small but clear in the quiet of the dining room. "Daddy, why do you look so sad all the time now?" The question hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't exploded yet, its detonation inevitable but suspended in that terrible moment of recognition. Damon's hand froze on his water glass, his breath catching in his throat, because he hadn't realized it was that obvious. hadn't known that his 10-year-old son had been carrying the weight of his father's unhappiness like a burden he didn't understand. Patricia's eyes moved from Isaiah to Damon, sharp and assessing, and in that moment she understood that whatever had been happening at his workplace had reached a critical point, that the man she loved was drowning, and she hadn't fully grasped how deep the water had become. "I'm fine, buddy," Damon started, but his voice broke on the words, and suddenly he couldn't finish the sentence because the lie was too big, too impossible to sustain in the face of his son's innocent concern. He felt his eyes begin to burn with tears he refused to let fall, felt his throat constrict with emotion he had been holding back for months, maybe years. But there were no words, no explanation that would make sense to a 10-year-old, no way to explain how a man could work so hard and be so good at what he does and still be told again and again that he wasn't enough. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that made Isaiah flinch. "Excuse me," he managed, and fled from the table before his son could see him break, before the tears could spill over, before the dam that had been holding back 4 years of humiliation and rage and despair could finally burst. He made it to their bedroom and closed the door, leaning against it with his eyes shut tight, his chest heaving with the effort of keeping the sods trapped inside. Downstairs, Isaiah looked at his mother with frightened eyes. "Did I say something wrong?" he whispered, and Patricia pulled him close, holding her son while her mind worked through what she had just witnessed. "No, baby," she assured him, kissing the top of his head. "You didn't do anything wrong. Daddy's he's going through something difficult, but it's going to be okay." The words were automatic, the kind of reassurance mothers give their children, but even as she spoke them, Patricia was making calculations and assessments, her general's mind already analyzing the situation and preparing for action.
An hour later, after Isaiah had been tucked into bed with extra hugs and reassurances, Patricia found Damon sitting on the edge of their bed in the dark, staring at nothing. She didn't turn on the light. She just sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, and waited. Because she knew her husband, knew that he was carrying something too heavy to hold alone, and that after years of trying to protect her from it, he was finally at the breaking point where pride gives way to need. "Talk to me," she said quietly. Not a command, but an invitation, an opening for him to finally let go of whatever burden he had been carrying in silence. And in the darkness of that room, with his son asleep down the hall and his wife's hand finding his in the shadows, Damon Archer felt the last of his defenses crumble. "I can't do this anymore," he whispered, his voice raw and broken. "I can't keep pretending it doesn't matter. I can't keep telling myself that next time will be different." And Patricia squeezed his hand, her voice steady and certain in the darkness. "Then tell me everything, and we'll figure out what comes next, together." The night deepened around them as they sat in the bedroom, the world outside reduced to distant sounds of traffic and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog, while inside that room, in the safety of darkness and the shelter of their marriage, Damon began to speak the truth he had been carrying alone for so long. And what started as a hesitant whisper became a flood, years of pain and humiliation pouring out in words that tumbled over each other, desperate to finally be heard, to finally be acknowledged as real and not imagined, as systematic and not accidental, as the deliberate destruction of a man's dignity by those who believed they had the right to decide who deserved to rise and who deserved to be kept down. "It's been 4 years," Damon began, his voice still rough from the tears he had shed, his hand gripping Patricia's like an anchor in a storm. 4 years since the first time they passed me over, and I told myself it was okay, that maybe I wasn't ready yet, that I needed to prove myself more. So I worked harder, I stayed later, I took on projects no one else wanted, solved problems that should have been impossible. I prevented 3 major security breaches that would have cost this company millions, Patricia. 3. And every time, Harrington praised my technical skills, told me I was invaluable, said I was doing exceptional work. Exceptional. That's what they call it when they need you to keep doing their impossible work but don't want to pay you what you're worth or give you the recognition you've earned. Patricia listened in silence, her general's mind already cataloging details, filing away names and patterns, building a case, even as our heart broke for the man beside her. She had known something was wrong, had sensed his growing frustration over the past few years, but she had respected his need to handle it himself, had trusted that he would come to her when he was ready. Now she understood that she had waited too long, that her husband had been suffering while she focused on her own career, and the guilt of that realization settled heavy in her chest. The first time was 2 years after I started at Titan Defense. They promoted a guy named Marcus Chen to senior analyst. Good guy, competent, but everyone knew I had more experience, better results. When I asked Harrington about it, he told me Marcus had leadership presence that I still needed to develop. Leadership presence. I didn't even know what that meant. So I asked him to clarify, asked what specific skills I needed to work on. And you know what he said? He said it wasn't about specific skills, it was about an intangible quality, something you either had or you didn't. And when I pressed him, he said maybe I was too focused on the technical side and needed to work on big picture thinking. So I did. I volunteered for strategic planning committees, I presented at company-wide meetings, I mentored junior engineers and helped shape division-wide security protocols. I did everything they said I needed to do. And then 18 months later, another senior analyst position opened up. I was sure it was mine. I had the metrics, the reviews, everything. His hand tightened on Patricia's, his breathing becoming shallow with the pain of remembering. They gave it to Jennifer Walsh. She was good, don't get me wrong, but she had less experience than me, fewer successful projects, and she'd only been at the company 3 years. When I asked Harrington why, he said Jennifer had demonstrated better cultural fit and stronger interpersonal skills. Cultural fit, Patricia. Do you understand what that means? It means I didn't fit. It means my face, my background, something about me made them uncomfortable, and they wrapped that prejudice in corporate language so they could deny it was racism.
Patricia felt rage building in her chest, cold and controlled. The kind of anger that comes from years of facing the same coded discrimination in her own career. The same impossible standards applied only to those who didn't fit the expected mold. But she said nothing yet, just held her husband's hand and let him continue, because this was his pain to speak, and her role right now was to witness it, to validate it, to let him know that he wasn't crazy or oversensitive or imagining things. And today, Damon's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Today was the 3rd time. Kyle Brennan. He's a decent guy, competent enough, but Patricia, he's nowhere near my level. He's been at the company 5 years, has a fraction of my accomplishments, and honestly doesn't even seem to want the position that much. But he went to the same university as Harrington's nephew. They were in the same fraternity. And when Harrington announced his promotion this morning, he used all the same phrases. Leadership presence, cultural fit, big picture thinking. Like he was reading from a script he'd used twice before. And everyone in that room knew. You could see it on their faces. Lisa Tron looked like she wanted to throw something. Kyle couldn't even meet my eyes. He turned to face Patricia in the darkness, and even though she couldn't see his face clearly, she could hear the break in his voice, the desperate need for her to understand, to believe him. I'm not imagining this, am I? I'm not being oversensitive or paranoid, because sometimes I lie awake at night wondering if I'm just not as good as I think I am, if maybe there really is something about me that makes me unfit for leadership, if maybe they're right and I'm wrong and I've been fooling myself this whole time about my own abilities. And that, Patricia realized, was perhaps the cruelest aspect of systematic discrimination. Not just the denial of opportunity, but the way it made its victims doubt themselves, question their own worth, internalize the lie that they were somehow deficient, when the only thing deficient was the system judging them. Her husband, brilliant, dedicated, exceptional in every measurable way, had been gaslit into questioning his own competence by men who knew that the best way to keep someone down was to make them believe they deserved to be there. "No," Patricia said, her voice firm and certain, cutting through his doubt like a blade. "You're not imagining it. You're not oversensitive, and you sure as hell aren't incompetent. Damon, listen to me." She cupped his face in her hands, making sure he could hear every word, every ounce of conviction in her voice. "What you've just described to me is textbook discrimination. It's sophisticated, it's coded, it's designed to have plausible deniability, but it's discrimination. And it's not just about you being passed over. It's about a pattern of behavior, a system designed to keep talented Black employees from advancing while mediocrity gets rewarded because it comes in the right package." She felt him shudder with relief, with the validation of finally being believed, finally being told that his perception of reality was accurate and not a delusion. "How long has this been going on?" she asked, her general's mind already working, already planning. "How many other people has Harrington done this to?" Damon took a shaky breath. "Lisa mentioned something once about keeping records, about noticing patterns in who gets promoted and who gets stuck. I didn't ask for details because I was trying to keep my head down, trying not to make waves, trying to believe that if I just worked hard enough, eventually merit would matter. But if Lisa's been watching, then there's documentation, there's evidence, there's a provable pattern of discrimination that goes beyond just your experience." She was quiet for a moment, thinking, calculating, considering the weight of her position and the ethics of using it, the fine line between appropriate oversight and abuse of power. But then she thought about her husband's face at the dinner table, about Isaiah asking why his father looked sad all the time, about 4 years of systematic humiliation and the erosion of dignity that no one should have to endure. "Do you trust me?" she asked quietly. And Damon nodded without hesitation, because if there was one thing he knew with absolute certainty, it was that his wife would never let him down. "Then I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to keep it to yourself until I'm ready to act. Titan Defense Solutions holds an $800 million contract with the Pentagon for cybersecurity infrastructure. Do you know who has final approval authority on that contract? Who conducts the compliance inspections? Who has the power to recommend suspension or termination if a contractor is found to be in violation of federal employment regulations?"
"Me," Patricia confirmed. "And Damon, I want you to understand something. I've kept my professional life separate from yours deliberately because I never wanted anyone to think you got any advantage from being married to me, never wanted to create a conflict of interest. But this," her voice hardened with resolve, "this isn't about giving you an advantage. This is about holding a defense contractor accountable for violating federal anti-discrimination laws. This is about using my authority for exactly what it was designed for, oversight and accountability. And if, in the process of conducting a thorough compliance inspection of Titan Defense Solutions, I happen to discover that they've been systematically discriminating against qualified employees while maintaining federal contracts, well, that's not personal. That's just me doing my job." Damon felt something shift inside him, felt hope beginning to kindle in the ashes of his despair. But there was fear there, too. Fear of retaliation, fear of making things worse, fear that he was somehow being weak by letting his wife fight his battles. "Patricia, I don't want you to jeopardize your career for me. I don't want anyone to say you abused your position or that this was about personal vendetta rather than legitimate oversight." "Then we do it right," she said firmly. "We document everything. We build an airtight case. We conduct a legitimate inspection with my team, Colonel Rivera, and auditors who don't know about our connection until after they've gathered their evidence. We follow every protocol, dot every I, cross every T. And when we're done, no one will be able to say this was personal because the evidence will speak for itself. But Damon, I need you to be ready for this. I need you to be willing to testify on record about what you've experienced. I need you to be prepared for the possibility that this will become public, that your name will be attached to this. Can you do that?" In the darkness of their bedroom, with his wife's hand still holding his face and her voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had never lost a battle she chose to fight, Damon Archer made a decision. He had spent 4 years playing by their rules, keeping his head down, believing that silent excellence would be enough. And it had earned him nothing but humiliation and self-doubt.
Perhaps it was time to stop being invisible. Perhaps it was time to let the world see exactly what Titan Defense Solutions had been doing to him and others like him. Perhaps it was time to stop carrying this weight alone. "Yes," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "I can do that. I'm ready." Patricia pulled him into her arms, holding him close while her mind was already racing ahead, already preparing to transform her husband's personal suffering into institutional accountability. "Then this ends now," she whispered into his hair. "I promise you, Damon, this ends now." And in that moment, neither of them knew just how far the revelations would spread, or how many lives would be changed by the decision they had just made in the darkness of their bedroom. They only knew that silence was no longer an option, that justice demanded action, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against systematic oppression is the truth, spoken aloud by those who refuse to be silenced any longer. Outside their window, the night deepened toward dawn, and somewhere across the city in a glass tower where men like Stephen Harrington believed themselves untouchable, the countdown to reckoning had already begun. The sun had barely risen over the Pentagon when Patricia Archer sat in her office, phone pressed to her ear, speaking with the one man she trusted to understand both the mission and the stakes. Colonel James Rivera had served beside her for 5 years, conducting compliance inspections of defense contractors with the kind of methodical precision that came from 2 decades in the military and a personal understanding of what institutional corruption looked like when it hid behind corporate polish and plausible deniability. "I need to schedule a comprehensive compliance inspection of Titan Defense Solutions," Patricia said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never once questioned whether she had the right to use her power for justice. "Full audit of their employment practices, promotion records, contract compliance documentation. I want you, Martinez, and Chen on the team." Rivera didn't ask why, didn't question the urgency in her tone, because he knew Patricia well enough to understand that when she initiated an unscheduled inspection, she had already identified something that needed to be brought into the light. "When do we move?" he asked simply, and Patricia felt a surge of gratitude for colleagues who understood that sometimes justice required action before all the explanations could be given. "Monday. I'm filing the paperwork this morning. Titan Defense will receive formal notice by end of business today." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "James, there's a personal element to this that I'll brief you on before we arrive, but I need you to conduct this inspection by the book. No shortcuts, no assumptions, just follow the evidence wherever it leads. Can you do that?" "Always do," Rivera replied, and she could hear the hint of steel in his voice that told her that he had already sensed this was bigger than a routine compliance check. They ended the call and Patricia turned to her computer, pulling up Titan Defense's contract history, their HR compliance records, and the NIA's
Previous inspection reports, their publicly available diversity statistics that showed a pattern any trained investigator would recognize immediately. A company that talked about inclusion in their marketing materials while their leadership remained overwhelmingly homogeneous. Meanwhile, across the city in the glass tower of Titan Defense Solutions, Damon sat at his desk staring at his computer screen without really seeing it, his mind still processing the conversation from the night before, still grappling with the reality that his wife was about to turn the full weight of Pentagon oversight onto the company that had systematically denied him recognition for years. He felt exposed and empowered in equal measure, terrified of what might come, but also electrified by the possibility that someone with real authority finally believed him, finally saw the injustice he had been living with. "Damon?" The voice startled him, and he looked up to find Lisa Tran standing beside his cubicle, her expression serious, her laptop tucked under one arm. "Can we talk? Somewhere private?" He nodded, and they found an empty conference room on the 3rd floor, one of the small, windowless spaces used for confidential calls. Lisa closed the door and set her laptop on the table, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened a password-protected file. "I need to show you something," she said quietly. "Something I've been documenting for 18 months. And then she turned the screen toward him, revealing a spreadsheet of devastating precision. Every promotion decision in their division for the past 3 years, color-coded by demographic data, annotated with performance review scores, technical achievements, and the stated reasons for each promotion or denial. The pattern was impossible to deny.
Every Black and Hispanic employee with exceptional performance reviews had been passed over at least once, often multiple times, while white employees with lower scores advanced consistently. And in a separate tab, Lisa had documented exact quotes from Harrington's promotion announcements, showing how the same coded phrases appeared again and again. Leadership presence, cultural fit, interpersonal dynamics. "Oh my God," Damon whispered, staring at the data that transformed his personal experience into an undeniable pattern of systematic discrimination. "Lisa, this is everything. How did you—" "I started keeping records after they passed me over for senior engineer 2 years ago," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Harrington told me I was too soft-spoken for leadership, even though I had the highest technical scores in the department. And I watched them do the same thing to you, to Marcus Rodriguez, to Keisha Johnson. I watched them promote mediocrity over excellence as long as that mediocrity came in the right skin color. And I decided that when the time came, when someone was finally ready to fight back, I would have proof that this wasn't just perception or sensitivity or isolated incidents. This is systematic. This is intentional. This is discrimination with a corporate vocabulary." Damon felt something shift inside him, the last remnants of self-doubt dissolving in the face of irrefutable evidence. "Are you willing to share this? Are you willing to go on record with what you've documented?" Lisa met his eyes with a determination that matched his own. "I've been waiting for someone to ask me that question for 18 months. Yes, I'm ready. Whatever it takes." Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of autumn in Virginia, the kind of day when the air felt charged with possibility and change. But inside the glass tower of Titan Defense Solutions, that charged atmosphere took on a very different quality when, at precisely 9 o'clock, Brigadier General Patricia Archer walked through the front doors flanked by Colonel James Rivera and 2 Pentagon auditors, all of them in full military dress uniform, their presence commanding immediate and absolute attention. The security guard at the front desk stood reflexively, his training recognizing rank even before his brain fully processed what he was seeing. Within seconds, phones were ringing throughout the building, managers scrambling to understand why a Pentagon general and her team had arrived unannounced, why no one had warned them this inspection was happening today, why the lobby suddenly felt like a courtroom where judgment was about to be passed. Robert Lancaster appeared from the executive elevators within 5 minutes, his face flushed and his tie slightly askew, the look of a man who had been pulled from a comfortable Monday morning routine into a situation he didn't understand and couldn't control. "Robert Lancaster," he said, extending his hand with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "General Archer, this is unexpected. I wasn't aware we had an inspection scheduled for today." Patricia shook his hand with the firm grip of someone who had spent 22 years in the military, learning how to command respect through presence alone. "Mr. Lancaster, we notified your company of this compliance inspection on Friday afternoon. I trust you received the documentation?" Her voice was professional, cordial even, but there was steel underneath that made it clear this was not a courtesy call. "Yes, of course," Lancaster said quickly, though his expression suggested he had not, in fact, read the notification carefully enough to understand its scope. "We're prepared to accommodate your team. What specifically will you be reviewing?"
Personnel files, promotion records, contract compliance documentation, and employee interviews, Patricia replied, each item delivered with the precision of someone who had conducted dozens of these inspections and knew exactly what questions to ask and what records to examine. "We'll need access to your HR systems, your division directors, and a representative sample of employees across all levels. This is a comprehensive review of your employment practices as they relate to your federal contract obligations." The words hung in the air like a sentence already passed, and Lancaster felt his stomach drop as he began to understand that this was not routine, that something had triggered this inspection, that his company was about to be examined under a microscope by people who knew exactly what patterns of discrimination looked like when they hid behind corporate language and diversity initiatives that existed only on paper. "Of course," he managed. "I'll have my assistant coordinate with your team. Should I gather my executives?"
Please, Patricia said, including your division directors. We'll need to speak with them individually. She paused, consulting a tablet one of her auditors handed her. Specifically, we'll need to interview Stephen Harrington, your cybersecurity division director. She looked up, her expression neutral, but her eyes missing nothing, and we'll also need to speak with several employees from his division, including Damon Archer, Lisa Tran, and Kyle Brennan. Somewhere on the 5th floor, Damon's phone buzzed with a text from Lancaster's assistant requesting his presence for an interview with the Pentagon inspection team. His hands shook slightly as he read the message, knowing that his wife was in this building right now, knowing that the machinery of accountability had been set in motion, knowing that there was no turning back from what was about to unfold. And in his corner office with its view of the Arlington skyline, Stephen Harrington received a similar message and felt nothing but mild irritation, the inconvenience of having his Monday disrupted by bureaucratic oversight. He had no idea that the woman in the general's uniform currently standing in his building's lobby was the wife of the man he had dismissed and diminished for 4 years. He had no idea that every coded phrase he had ever used, every promotion he had denied, every pattern of bias he thought he had hidden behind professional language was about to be exposed under the kind of scrutiny that could end careers and destroy reputations. He straightened his tie, grabbed his coffee, and headed downstairs to meet the inspection team, confident in his ability to charm and deflect, utterly unaware that he was walking directly into the storm that would consume him. The conference room on the 3rd floor had been converted into a temporary command center for the Pentagon inspection team, and by midday it had become the epicenter of an earthquake that was quietly tearing through the foundations of Titan Defense Solutions. Patricia and Rivera worked with the efficiency of surgeons, each interview methodical and precise, each document request strategic and deliberate, building a case piece by piece with the patience of people who understood that justice required more than accusations. It required proof that could withstand any challenge. Lisa Tran was their first interview, and she came prepared. She sat across from Patricia and Rivera with her laptop open, her 18 months of documentation laid out like evidence at a trial, and she spoke with the calm precision of someone who had been waiting for this moment, rehearsing it in her mind, knowing that her testimony could either validate or undermine everything Damon had claimed. "I began keeping these records 2 years ago," she explained, her fingers navigating through tabs and spreadsheets with practiced ease. "After I was passed over for senior engineer despite having the highest technical performance scores in the department. Director Harrington told me I was too soft-spoken for leadership, which I later learned was the same justification he used for other women and minorities in our division." Patricia leaned forward, her expression giving nothing away, but her eyes sharp with focus. "And these records show what, specifically?" Lisa turned the laptop so they could see the color-coded spreadsheet, the demographic breakdowns, the performance scores, the promotion decisions. "They show that over a 3-year period, every Black and Hispanic employee in our division with exceptional performance reviews was passed over for promotion at least once, often multiple times, while white employees with lower scores advanced consistently. The statistical probability of this being random is essentially 0. Rivera took notes with mechanical precision, documenting everything, while Patricia asked follow-up questions that revealed she understood exactly what institutional discrimination looked like when it wore a suit and spoke in HR-approved language and diversity initiatives that existed only on paper. When the interview concluded, Lisa walked out feeling both liberated and terrified, knowing she had just become a whistleblower, knowing her career at Titan Defense would never be the same regardless of how this ended. Kyle Brennan came next, and his interview was a study of cognitive dissonance, a man confronting his own complicity in a system that had rewarded him for nothing more than fitting the expected mold. He sat across from the general and the colonel, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his face pale as they asked him about his recent promotion. "Do you believe you were the most qualified candidate for the senior cybersecurity analyst position?" Patricia asked, her tone neutral, giving him no indication of what answer she expected or wanted.
Kyle swallowed hard, the question forcing him to voice what he had been avoiding for days. "No," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Damon Archer was more qualified. He has more experience, better technical skills, higher performance reviews. Everyone in the division knows it."
The admission hung in the air like a confession, and Rivera's pen scratched across his notepad, documenting another crack in Harrington's carefully constructed facade. But the real earthquake came when Vanessa Okonkwo, the HR director, was called for her interview. She walked into that conference room carrying the weight of 4 years of suppressed complaints, 4 years of being overruled by senior management who protected Stephen Harrington because of his family connections. 4 years of becoming exactly what she had never wanted to be, an enabler of the system rather than a defender of the employees. Patricia saw it in her face immediately, that particular expression of someone who had been carrying a burden too heavy and too long, who was exhausted from the effort of maintaining a lie. "Ms. Okonkwo," Patricia said quietly, "we've received testimony suggesting there may be additional documentation relevant to our investigation. Documentation that hasn't been included in the official files we've reviewed so far." It wasn't a question, and Vanessa understood immediately that this was her moment, that she could either continue protecting a corrupt system or she could finally do what she had been hired to do 4 years ago, protect the employees. Her hand shook as she opened her locked filing cabinet and pulled out a folder thick with documents, complaint forms that had been filed and suppressed, emails from senior management ordering her to close investigations, memos documenting Harrington's discriminatory comments that had been deemed not actionable. She laid it all on the table like a bomb being diffused, and when she looked up at Patricia and Rivera, tears were streaming down her face. "I kept copies of everything," she whispered, "because I knew this was wrong. I knew someone would eventually ask, and I needed to be able to prove that I tried, that I documented it, that I didn't just ignore what was happening." Patricia reached across the table and placed her hand over Vanessa's, a gesture of understanding from one woman who had navigated institutional power to another who had tried and failed to use hers for good. "You're doing the right thing now," she said firmly, "and this documentation will ensure that the truth can't be denied or dismissed." Rivera was already photographing each document, creating an evidence trail that would be impossible to destroy or hide. And as the afternoon sun slanted through the conference room windows, the foundation of Stephen Harrington's career began to crumble under the weight of truth that could no longer be suppressed. The main conference room had never felt smaller than it did when Stephen Harrington walked in that afternoon, his coffee cup still in hand, his expression carrying that particular blend of irritation and confidence that came from years of believing himself untouchable. He had kept the Pentagon inspection team waiting for 20 minutes, a subtle power play that would have worked in any normal circumstance, but today it only served to highlight his fundamental misunderstanding of the situation he was walking into. Patricia sat at the head of the table, with Rivera standing behind her like a sentinel, and the document spread before them represented 4 years of systematic discrimination laid bare in black and white, testimony and evidence that formed a noose tightening around Harrington's career. "Mr. Harrington," Patricia began, her voice professionally neutral, giving no indication of the personal stake she held in this moment. "Thank you for joining us. We have some questions regarding your division's promotion practices over the past 4 years. She gestured to the chair across from her, and Harrington sat with the casual ease of someone who had deflected uncomfortable questions 100 times before, who believed that charm and carefully chosen words could smooth over any scrutiny. "Of course, General," he said, flashing that practiced smile. "I'm happy to clarify anything you need. We take our federal contract obligations very seriously, and I'm proud of the culture we've built in the cybersecurity division." The words were rehearsed, the kind of corporate speak that said everything and nothing, designed to create the appearance of cooperation while revealing no actual information. Patricia opened the folder and began methodically laying out the evidence, promotion statistics showing clear demographic patterns, testimony from Lisa Tran documenting coded language, Kyle Brennan's admission that he wasn't the most qualified candidate, Vanessa Okonkwo's suppressed complaint files. With each piece of evidence, Harrington's confident expression began to crack, his explanations becoming more defensive, his coded language more transparent as Patricia dissected each excuse with surgical precision.
You've used the phrase leadership presence to justify promotion decisions 17 times in the past 4 years, she noted, her finger tracing down Lisa's spreadsheet. Can you define that phrase in measurable terms? Harrington shifted in his seat, recognizing the trap but unable to avoid it. It's about intangible qualities, the ability to command respect, to inspire confidence in both subordinates and clients. The answer was automatic, the same deflection he had used countless times before. But in this room, under this scrutiny, it sounded hollow and evasive. "And you don't believe Damon Archer possesses these intangible qualities?" Patricia asked, her voice still neutral but her eyes sharp as blades. Despite his 8 years of exceptional
Performance reviews? His prevention of 3 major security breaches? His technical expertise that multiple supervisors have called invaluable? She slid another document across the table, Damon's performance file, each page marked with praise and recognition that made Harrington's promotion denials look increasingly indefensible. "Damon is an excellent technical resource," Harrington said carefully, falling back on the same coded language that had served him for years. "But technical skill doesn't automatically translate to leadership capability. He's very focused on the technical side, perhaps too focused, which limits his ability to see the bigger strategic picture." The words came out smoothly, practiced, and in that moment, Harrington believed he had successfully navigated the question, had provided a justification that sounded reasonable enough to deflect further scrutiny. Patricia let the silence hang for a long moment, watching Harrington's face, seeing the subtle relaxation as he thought he had passed the test. And then she delivered the words that would shatter his world completely. "Mr. Harrington," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "Damon Archer is my husband, and you've just spent the last 15 minutes explaining to a Pentagon general why you've systematically discriminated against her family member for 4 years. The color drained from Harrington's face as if someone had opened a valve and let all the blood run out. His coffee cup slipped slightly in his grip, his mouth opening and closing without sound, his brain struggling to process the catastrophic miscalculation he had just made. This wasn't just a routine inspection. This wasn't just federal oversight. This was personal, and he had walked directly into a trap of his own making, had used his coded discriminatory language against the very person who held the power to destroy everything he had built. I didn't," he stammered, his carefully constructed professional facade crumbling into incoherent fragments. "General, I assure you, this has nothing to do with, the promotion decisions were based purely on merit and departmental needs, not on any personal—" "Save it," Rivera cut in, his voice hard as iron. "We have testimony from multiple employees, statistical evidence of bias, suppressed HR complaints, and your own words on record. This isn't about one promotion, Mr. Harrington. This is about a pattern of systematic discrimination that violates federal employment law and puts your company's Pentagon contract in jeopardy." Patricia stood, gathering her documents with the finality of someone who had passed judgment. "And Mr. Harrington?" She looked at him with eyes that held no mercy, only the cold satisfaction of justice finally being served. "You should contact your lawyer." News of Harrington's removal spread through Titan Defense Solutions like wildfire through dried timber, whispers racing down corridors and through cubicles, emails and texts flying as employees tried to understand what had just happened, why their division director had been escorted from the building by security, why the Pentagon inspection team was still conducting interviews with an intensity that suggested this was far more than routine oversight. And as the afternoon wore into evening, as more employees were called for testimony and more documents were reviewed, the full scope of the rot began to emerge. This wasn't just about one racist manager, it was about a culture that had protected him, a system that had enabled discrimination because it was more convenient than accountability. Robert Lancaster sat in his office on the top floor, staring at the preliminary findings that Patricia had just presented to him with the clinical precision of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. The $800 million Pentagon contract was suspended. Federal investigators were being called in. The company's stock would plummet when this became public. And perhaps most devastating for a man who prided himself on his military service and his company's defense work, he had betrayed the values he claimed to uphold, had allowed discrimination to flourish under his leadership because he hadn't cared enough to look beneath the surface, hadn't wanted to risk uncomfortable confrontations with shareholders and power brokers. "Mr. Harrington," Patricia said, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority, "Damon Archer's discriminatory practices are well documented, but what's equally concerning is the institutional complicity that allowed those practices to continue. Your HR director kept files of suppressed complaints. Your senior management overruled legitimate grievances to protect someone with family connections. This isn't just a personnel problem. This is a systemic failure of leadership." Lancaster felt the walls closing in, felt the weight of decisions he hadn't made, conversations he hadn't had, warning signs he had deliberately ignored because addressing them would have been difficult and politically costly. "What do I need to do?" he asked quietly, the question of a man who finally understood that survival required more than damage control. It required genuine transformation. "You need to demonstrate that Titan Defense is committed to real change, not just public relations. Independent oversight, transparent promotion processes, accountability for past wrongs, and meaningful consequences for those who enabled this culture. Half measures won't restore your contract, Mr. Lancaster. The Pentagon doesn't do business with companies that violate federal employment law." The message was clear: change or collapse, and the choice was his alone to make.
Meanwhile, in a small office on the third floor, Patricia finally allowed herself a moment with her husband. Damon had been called in for his formal interview, and as he sat across from his wife in the sterile conference room, with Rivera discreetly stepping outside to give them privacy, the weight of the day finally caught up with both of them. "Are you okay?" Patricia asked softly, and Damon shook his head because he wasn't okay. Wouldn't be okay for a long time, but for the first time in 4 years, he felt something other than hopeless. "I watched them escort Harrington out," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I watched his face when he realized what was happening, and Patricia, I didn't feel triumph. I felt sad. Sad that it took this, that it required someone with your power to make anyone listen, that 4 years of my life were stolen by a system that never saw me as worthy." He looked at his wife with eyes that held both gratitude and grief. "Thank you for believing me. Thank you for using your position to fight for me. But I hate that I needed you to fight it all." Patricia reached across the table and took his hands, and for a moment they weren't a general at a witness, but simply two people who loved each other, navigating a broken system together. "I know," she whispered, "and I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what you were carrying. But Damon, this isn't just about you anymore. It's about every person who's been discriminated against in this company, every complaint that was suppressed, every talented employee who was told they weren't good enough when the truth was they were too good for a system designed to diminish them." Outside the conference room, Margaret Hughes was already crafting her first article. Her journalist's instincts recognizing that this story was bigger than one company, that it represented a reckoning that defense contractors across the nation needed to face. And as the evening deepened into night, as employees filed out of Titan Defense with their minds racing and their phones buzzing with the news that was beginning to leak, the machinery of public accountability began to turn, transforming a private corporate matter into a national conversation about justice, discrimination, and the cost of silence. Margaret Hughes's article dropped like a bomb 3 days later, published simultaneously in the Washington Post and distributed across every major news platform with the kind of viral momentum that only comes from stories that touch a nerve in the national consciousness. Pentagon general exposes systematic racism at defense contractor after husband denied promotion, the headline read.
and beneath it was a comprehensive exposé that detailed not just Damon's story, but the broader pattern of discrimination at Titan Defense Solutions, the suppressed complaints, the coded language, the institutional complicity that had protected Stephen Harrington for years despite overwhelming evidence of his bias. By noon, the story was trending on every social media platform, with hashtags demanding accountability and reform spreading like wildfire across the digital landscape. Defense industry employees began sharing their own stories of discrimination, creating a chorus of voices that could no longer be ignored or dismissed as isolated incidents. Titan Defense's stock dropped 18% in a single trading day, and shareholders who had been content to ignore company culture when profits were strong suddenly demanded answers, demanded action, demanded that someone be held responsible for the financial and reputational damage that systematic discrimination had caused. Damon watched it all unfold from his living room. His laptop opened to news sites that were covering his story, his phone ringing constantly with interview requests from journalists, advocates, civil rights organizations, and former colleagues who wanted to share their own experiences or offer support. It was overwhelming and validating and exhausting all at once. The transformation from private individual to public symbol happening faster than he could process. His face appearing on television screens as talking heads debated employment discrimination and Pentagon oversight and whether Patricia had abused her authority or used it appropriately. Patricia faced her own storm, fielding calls from Pentagon colleagues who questioned whether her personal involvement in the Titan Defense inspection represented a conflict of interest, whether she had overstepped her authority by investigating a company where her husband worked. But for every critic, there were 3 supporters who recognized that her actions represented exactly what oversight was designed for, holding contractors accountable when they violated federal regulations regardless of personal connections. The Inspector General's office launched a review of her conduct, and Patricia welcomed it, confident that the evidence would vindicate her decisions, that the documentation was so extensive and the pattern so clear that no objective observer could claim this was personal vendetta rather than legitimate accountability.
At Titan Defense, Robert Lancaster faced a shareholder meeting that felt more like a trial. Angry investors demanding to know how systematic discrimination had been allowed to flourish under his leadership, how the company had jeopardized an $800 million contract through negligence and institutional complicity. He stood before them with no easy answers, no simple explanations, only a commitment to fundamental change that he knew would be measured not in words, but in actions over the coming months and years. Stephen Harrington, meanwhile, hired an expensive legal team and prepared to fight the federal discrimination charges, but found himself increasingly isolated as former allies distanced themselves. As his father-in-law, Thomas Harrington Sr., quietly divested his shares rather than face continued public association with the scandal. The sophisticated racism that had served Harrington so well in corporate settings looked exactly like what it was when exposed in plain language the public could understand, and no amount of legal maneuvering could erase the documented pattern of bias, the testimony of multiple employees, the suppressed complaints that revealed years of institutional knowledge and deliberate inaction. And through it all, Damon struggled with the strange dichotomy of vindication and violation, of having his truth finally believed while simultaneously having that truth dissected and debated by strangers who had never walked in his shoes, who reduced 4 years of his life to talking points and political arguments. But when he received emails from other employees who had been discriminated against, thanking him for speaking up, telling him that his courage had given them courage, he began to understand that his story had become bigger than his personal pain. The justice required public reckoning, even when that reckoning was uncomfortable and invasive and exhausting. The public storm raged on, and somewhere in the eye of that storm, the Archer family held on to each other and waited for the moment when the immediate crisis would pass, and they could begin the hard work of figuring out what justice and healing actually looked like beyond the headlines. 3 months had passed since the inspection that changed everything, and the world looked different now, in ways both visible and subtle. Stephen Harrington had been fired and faced federal discrimination charges that his expensive legal team couldn't dismiss. The evidence too extensive, the pattern too clear, the testimony too damning.
Thomas Harrington Sr., rather than weather the public shame, had quietly divested his shares and withdrawn from the company he had helped build, learning too late that wealth and connections couldn't protect against accountability when the truth was documented in black and white. And in the executive suite of Titan Defense Solutions, Robert Lancaster had discovered that genuine institutional change required more than press releases and diversity consultants. It required fundamental restructuring of power and transparent systems that could withstand scrutiny. Vanessa Okonkwo now held the title of Chief Diversity and Compliance Officer, her promotion both a recognition of her courage in revealing suppressed complaints and a strategic move to demonstrate that Titan Defense was serious about reform. She had hired an independent oversight board, implemented transparent promotion processes with multiple reviewers, and created anonymous reporting channels that actually led to investigation rather than suppression. The Pentagon contract had been conditionally reinstated with strict monitoring requirements, and every quarter Patricia's team would conduct reviews to ensure compliance wasn't just promised but practiced. And Damon Archer, after 3 months of soul-searching and difficult conversations with his wife, had made his decision. He sat in the same conference room where Kyle Brennan's promotion had been announced, but this time he was the one at the head of the table, the new director of cybersecurity, a position that Lancaster had offered him with genuine contrition and the acknowledgement that this recognition was years overdue. Lisa Tran had been promoted to senior analyst, her documentation recognized as the crucial evidence that transformed individual complaints into provable patterns. And Kyle, humbled and educated by the experience, worked under Damon's leadership with a new understanding of privilege and complicity, learning that being a good person required more than passive decency, it required active resistance to unjust systems. But tonight, as Damon drove home through the familiar streets of Arlington, he carried with him the complexity of his victory. He had won, yes, the promotion he deserved, the public vindication, the institutional changes that would help others avoid what he had suffered. But he also carried the scars of 4 years stolen by systematic discrimination, the exhaustion of becoming a public figure when he had only wanted to be an excellent engineer, the knowledge that justice had required his wife's intervention rather than the merit he had believed would be sufficient. At home, Patricia was in civilian clothes for once. No middles, no medals, just his wife making dinner while Isaiah worked on his solar system model at the kitchen table. The scene was ordinary, beautifully ordinary, and Damon felt something loosen in his chest as he walked through that red door and into the warmth of family. "Dad," Isaiah called out, abandoning his solar system model to hug his father. "Mr. Chen said he saw you on the news again. He said you're a hero."
Damon knelt down to his son's level, choosing his words carefully. "I'm not a hero, buddy. I'm just someone who finally spoke up about something that was wrong. And I had help, lots of help, from people who were brave enough to stand with me." He glanced at Patricia, who was watching them with soft eyes, and felt gratitude wash over him for the partnership that had made all of this possible. "Are things fixed now?" Isaiah asked, the question echoing what he had asked 3 months ago, but this time Damon had a better answer, an honest answer shaped by hard-won wisdom. "Some things are better," he said slowly. "The company has new rules, new leaders, people who are watching to make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to others. But Isaiah, the fight for real justice never completely ends. It gets better, people get smarter, systems improve, but we always have to keep watching. Keep speaking up. Keep holding each other accountable. That's how change actually works. Not all at once, but piece by piece, person by person, day by day." Isaiah nodded with the seriousness of a child who understood that adult truths weren't always simple or satisfying, but they were true nonetheless. He returned to his project, and Damon stood, moving to the kitchen where Patricia handed him a glass of wine and leaned against his shoulder in comfortable silence. "Do you regret it? The public exposure, the scrutiny, becoming a symbol instead of just an engineer?" Damon considered the question, thinking about the emails from other employees who had been discriminated against, thanking him for his courage, thinking about the changes at Titan Defense that were imperfect but real, thinking about his son learning that standing up for justice mattered more than staying comfortable. "No," he said finally. "I wish it hadn't been necessary. I wish merit had been enough.
But I don't regret speaking the truth, even when it was hard, even when it cost me privacy and peace. Because silence would have cost me more. It would have cost me my self-respect. As they sat down to dinner together, the Archer family felt the weight of the past 3 months settling into something manageable, something they could carry forward into whatever came next. Damon had proven his worth beyond any doubt, not to Stephen Harrington or Robert Lancaster or anyone else, but to himself. He had learned that excellence alone wasn't enough in a broken system, but that excellence combined with courage, documentation, and people willing to stand together could transform institutional injustice into institutional accountability. The fight wasn't over. It never really was. But for tonight, in this warm house with his son's laughter and his wife's hand in his, Damon Archer allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in 4 years. Not just vindication or relief, but genuine hope for the future. And that perhaps was the truest form of justice. Not the ending of struggle, but the restoration of the belief that struggle could lead to change, that voices raised together could be heard, and that dignity once reclaimed could never again be easily taken away. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.
The morning sun cut through the glass walls of Titan Defense Solutions like a blade, sharp and unforgiving, illuminating the sterile conference room where careers were made and broken with the casual cruelty of men who believed their power was absolute. And on this gray Monday morning, as autumn leaves swirled outside the windows and the scent of expensive coffee filled the air, Damon Archer sat among his colleagues, his hands folded carefully on the table before him, his face a mask of professional composure that had taken him 8 years to perfect. 8 years of excellence. 8 years of staying late when others went home, of solving problems that should have been impossible, of preventing security breaches that would have brought this company to its knees. 8 years of waiting for the promise that had been whispered to him again and again, like a prayer that was never answered. Your time is coming, Damon. Just around the corner.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But as Stephen Harrington stood at the head of that table, his smile confident and his posture relaxed in the way of men who had never once questioned whether they deserved their place in the world, Damon felt something cold settling his chest, because he had seen this before, twice before, and the words that came from Harrington's mouth were familiar in their careful construction, in their coded cruelty, in the way they could destroy a man's dreams while sounding perfectly reasonable to anyone who didn't know how to listen for what wasn't being said. "I'm pleased to announce," Harrington began, his voice carrying that particular blend of authority and false warmth that middle management had perfected, that after careful consideration of all the qualified candidates, we've selected Kyle Brennan for the senior cybersecurity analyst position. And there it was, the knife, sliding between ribs with surgical precision. Damon's eyes found Kyle across the table, watched the younger man's face flush with something that looked uncomfortably like shame, watched him fail to meet Damon's gaze. "Kyle brings exactly the kind of leadership presence we need in this role," Harrington continued, each word chosen with the precision of someone who had been trained never to say what he actually meant. His cultural fit with the team, his big-picture thinking, his ability to navigate complex interpersonal dynamics, these are the qualities that will take our division to the next level. Leadership presence, cultural fit, big-picture thinking. The phrases hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had just been fired, and everyone in that room knew what they really meant, even if no one would ever say it out loud. Because that was how it worked in places like this. in gleaming corporate towers where diversity was celebrated in glossy brochures but quietly suffocated behind closed doors. You couldn't point to any single word that was wrong. You couldn't prove that leadership presence meant anything other than what the dictionary said. But Damon knew. God, how he knew. Because he had heard these same phrases used to explain why he wasn't quite right for the last promotion and the one before that. And now this one. The third time in 4 years that he had been passed over for a position he had earned with blood and sweat and brilliance that no one in this room could honestly deny. He felt his reflection staring back at him from the glass walls. A black man in a perfectly pressed shirt and tie, his MIT degree framed on the wall of his cubicle 3 floors down, his performance reviews all marked exceptional, his technical skills unmatched by anyone in this division. And yet here he sat, watching a man with half his experience and a quarter of his talent receive the recognition that should have been his. Damon's hands tightened imperceptibly on the table, his jaw clenched just slightly, and for a brief moment, his carefully maintained professional mask cracked. Just a hairline fracture, barely visible, but enough that Lisa Tran, sitting 2 seats away, caught his eye with a look of shared fury and frustration that told him he wasn't imagining this, that she saw it too, that the injustice was real and visible to anyone brave enough to look. The meeting continued, Harrington's voice droning on about strategic initiatives and quarterly goals, but Damon heard none of it. Because something inside him had broken. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet finality of a support beam giving way after years of bearing too much weight. This wasn't anger, not yet. This was something deeper and more terrible. It was the moment when hope dies, when a man who was played by every rule and exceeded every expectation finally understands that the game was rigged from the start, that no amount of excellence will ever be enough, that his invisibility is not an accident, but a feature of a system designed to keep him exactly where he is.